So hello, I'm Duncan Carson. I'm the Projects and Business Manager at the Independent Cinema Office, which is the lead organisation in Film Hub Southeast. Before I go any further, this session is being live captioned by Nicola, who's our captioner, palimpsest. And she, if you want to, Sammy's going to drop, my colleague's going to drop in the details for where you can follow along with those captions on an external link. So if you would like to use captions, those are available. So before I get on with my questions to Megan and introduce her, I just want to let you know how the session is going to run. We're going to talk for about an hour. There's going to be about 30 questions, 30 minutes of questions from me, and then 30 minutes of questions from the audience. So the onus is on you to fill that. If the second half an hour of this is not as entertaining, it's all down to you. So try and come up with stimulating questions, and the place to put those is not within the chat, but on the Q&A function. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll have chat and Q&A. So drop them into the Q&A rather than the chat function, and then we'll come to those in the second half. That's all. I think that's all we need to talk about in terms of the admin. We'll talk a little bit more about the watch party later in the call. So yeah, so thanks for joining us and making excellent life decisions with your Thursday late afternoon. This is really a nice thing because occasionally at work you get given, someone says to you, could you do this thing? And you think that's good because that's something I would like to do in any circumstances. Even if, and to do it in a professional space is really nice. So this is exciting for me because I get to ask some questions that I personally like the answers to. Because I've always really admired the level of energy and ambition Megan has brought to film exhibition through Matchbox Cine Club, which she runs with Sean, her partner on the project. So that just to, if you're not familiar with their work, some of the things that stand out to me is their amazing cult film weekend, A Weird Weekend, which celebrates the obscure and underseen. And then they've got Cage-a-rama and Keanucon, two sort of festivals championing two true Hollywood mavericks, and they've produced a whole host of other events that speak to making sure people get to see films from the margins that are nonetheless essential. And I think that the level of care they bring to their events is really inspiring, and that's why I'm excited to talk to Megan this afternoon. Whether that means bringing in Nicolas Cage's, that care manifests in bringing in Nicolas Cage's stunt double, providing access to all via their commitment to accessibility materials like hard of hearing subtitles or pay what you can tickets. So all of that's why I'm very excited to be able to share some of Megan's experience on this platform. So Megan, welcome after all that.
Thank you. That was such a nice introduction.
My pleasure. So I guess, obviously I've talked in sort of very glowing terms, but the Matchbox Cine Club is part of your career and, your time in film. So I guess just to give people that broader perspective on what you've done, how you got into this, do you want to just talk a little bit more about did you always want to work in film programming and film event production, and just a little bit about your career path and how you ended up working on this project?
Yeah, so I think like many young people had no idea that film programming was even a job. So I got involved in film programming when I was about 15 years old. So I come from the East End of Glasgow, and if anyone's familiar with the East End of Glasgow, it's not particularly an opportunity-rich environment, particularly for the arts. It's a very working class area, it's very underserved when it comes to lots of different facilities, but certainly cinema was not one of the things that was readily available to me. And then when I was about 15, like I say, my English teacher, thanks to free tickets from the cinema and then free buses provided by the local council, were able to take us to our local independent cinema. And I was just absolutely enthralled. It was the first time I was seeing a non-English language film with subtitles in the cinema. It was the first time I was really experiencing cinema in that type of setting. And I was very lucky that my local cinema had a young programmers team at that point, which I immediately joined out of just sheer enthusiasm. And that was in 2009, and I've been working in film programming and film events in various guises for the last nearly 11 years now. So I think my path through film has been a wee bit atypical. I don't think that there is a set path through film, but hopefully I think now that there's more easier and clear ways for young people to progress if you do, like me, start out in young programming and then can move through into other projects. So I think a lot of my career has been a wee bit, you know, tenuous and arduous in terms of what comes next, but I was very lucky in that, particularly in Scotland, there's a lot of really active independent exhibitors who are really charging on and doing their own thing, finding scrapping funding from various different pots, and just really a nice environment, I guess, to continue doing the work that we're doing. So yeah, that's where I started, and over the last 11 years I've done lots of different things, from working in film festivals, working in Matchbox for the past 3 years, doing a lot of work with youth advocacy, because when I came into young programming at the time, I certainly not only was one of the youngest programmers out there, I guess, but the only really working class programmer that I'd ever came across, and certainly with a East End Glaswegian accent. And even over the last 11 years, we've seen some really great leaps in terms of young people being able to get involved in film programming and really start to carve their own niches there. We're not really seeing working class young people having the same opportunities.
Okay, that's great. So I get, like, one of the things I think is, like, it's just to kind of bring people more into what Matchbox is. Like, I think one of the things that's quite exciting about it, as a, like, you know, I don't live in Glasgow, and even though my heart is always this close to coming up when for one of the big events, yet to come, but like, it's definitely one of those things where whenever you announce a new film, like, oh, what is this? What are they doing? Like, it's definitely something that I'm always intrigued by the programming. But on the other hand, it's never something where I go, oh, it's going to be this type of film, or those, like this, you know, like a genre, you know, kind of like, you know, national cinema or anything like that. It doesn't have that through line. But there's definitely things where I can go, that's a Matchbox type of program. That's their kind of event. So I guess, like, what's the basis when you're what's the starting point when you're creating a program? Is it about individual films, or is it about like the feel of the event?
Yeah, so like you said in your intro, I'm really lucky that my colleague in Matchbox is Sean Welsh, who has a very intense passion, I guess, in terms of programming, particularly underscreened and undervalued gems. So I wouldn't want to speak on his programming reach, which is quite far, but I think taking an example of something that I programmed recently was our Kaleidoscopic Realms season, which focused on experimental Japanese cinema, which seems like this really niche and far away type of interest, but actually it came about because one afternoon I was sitting, and I'm a big fan of the author Murakami, so I was Googling to see if there had ever been adaptations of his work, and buried down in IMDb is a couple of short films based off of his short book, short stories. And long story short, it brought us to find this director, Yamakawa, who had never screened outside of Cannes or Edinburgh since '82. So there's something there, I guess, in terms of sometimes programming is like catching a lightning bolt. If you just have a little thread that you're starting to pull, and you unravel into all of these wonderful programming ideas. And with Kaleidoscopic Realms from Yamakawa, we then started up a whole different strand, I guess, of programming, including Nobuhiko Obayashi, who's a wee bit more recognizable, and some of his contemporaries that we were able to find threads and common styles within their filmmaking that went together. In terms of some of our more, I guess, populous events like Keanucon and Cage-a-rama, when we program them, there's actually a lot of care and thought that has to go into them, and I really like them in terms of examples of thinking about programs, because you can imagine that bringing together a Nicolas Cage film festival should be super easy because he has so many films. He's making constantly new films every year. But when we're programming something like that, we have to think about, a really good example is the first year where it was our first really big weekend festival. We thought we'll do Action Cage on one day and Romance Cage on the other. And we ended up on the first day with just a room full of men who wanted to hug me at the end of it, but not the men working. And then the next day, we ended up with like not many people to come see his more obscure romance films, I guess. And from that, I guess we learned a type of understanding and balance about our programming, and that actually everything that we do moving forward has to have that same type of care and balance and understanding that actually when you're programming something, you're kind of holding the audience's hand and letting, you know, your programming decide how they interact and how they feel about a project. So I don't know if that answered your question, but it's
no.
How programs grow is really they can be quite personal, and I think that being led by your own personal viewpoints and insights is really important when you're approaching programming, and I think that you can see that in specific programming, the taste of the programmer, and even if it's not a film that they would necessarily personally watch, that they have that developed understanding and insight into how something will fit around other things and interact with the audience throughout their journey through a program or a season or whatever it may be.
Yeah, so you got, I mean, it's, yeah, you got to follow your own enthusiasm, two sides of the same coin, like your Con Airs and your Moonstrucks, you know, get you someone who can do both. So like, I guess the thing that's interesting, just following on from that, I mean, I guess the thing that's interesting is that like the challenge always is when you're, you know, if you have that enthusiasm for things that are outside the mainstream, you know, like obviously there's a kind of programming that's like a slightly easier, which is or requires less research, let's say, which is like, you know, I want to show this film, it's okay, I can look it up on Film Bank, I can get a single title license and show that. But like in a way, it's a fantastic what you do, but you really make a rod for your back, and like from my perspective, and you know, whenever we're sort of counseling people about their programming choices, you should start with what's available. That's not what you do at all, and they're all for the better. So I guess it's like, how do you go about, so you know, you see those films on an IMDb list, and we all know as you know, like one of the challenging things about being a programmer is the barriers between you going, I know where the film is and I've seen the film, I have access to the film, and can I screen it in public, are often really wide. Like, how do you sort of kind of go, like, how do you go about planning those things when often like the time involved, you know, like you can't always be sure that you're going to be able to find the films and make them available to be screened?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We're always very conscious, I think, because we do work with so many rare and hard to screen films, that we are always doing that massive due diligence. And I don't think we've ever self-indemnified or screened without a rights holder, simply because we know that there's always going to be one out there. And a really good example is, again, Kaleidoscopic Realm. So I wanted to screen this film by Yamakawa, and getting Japanese licensing is notoriously difficult when you have a distributor, let alone when they have no distribution. And that was a lot of squirreling back. I'd found that a copy had been screened at an academic conference in Manchester a few years ago. Through some Googling, I reached out to the university. They sent me to a library in New York. The library in New York knew nothing about it. And it actually came down to emailing the university that the director is now a professor at in Japanese, the intake office, because they had no other email address available. And then we found out that he's actually quite an active part of his local theatre company. So we emailed the local theatre company to get in touch, and a few weeks later he emailed back on his own personal account saying, oh, I heard from a few different avenues that you were trying to reach out to me. And that actually started up a really nice conversation, because he has access to all of these original prints, and he has access to you know, information and history about the film that we wouldn't have otherwise. So that's a really nice example of following that thread, and I think that that's one of the reasons I would always encourage people to really do that type of research and legwork, because it can, like you said, the timeline for these things can stretch on, and if you're working to a deadline, maybe that's not practical. But I think that if you always build in these research periods into your planning, and before you've even got your budget, then that's really beneficial, because when you do come to end up finding who owns the rights, often with these rare under-screen things, you are going to pull that thread back to someone who's involved in the production, or the director themselves, or someone that is able to enrich what you're actually doing, instead of you just saying, okay, well, I emailed this one inbox, no one replied, self-indemnify, on you go. And I would also say as well that have a look at who else has screened it legally, to find out if they will happily share the rights, because a lot of the times with these films, if they have screened somewhere else in the world, programmers are a really friendly bunch, especially if you're trying to screen something that they're also passionate about, that they would usually help you and give you some information.
Okay, so it's a combination of detective work, building enough time, and flexing the network and reaching out to people as much as you can. Yeah, I mean, that's yeah. Having tried to program a big Japanese season earlier this year, which got COVIDized. Yeah, I fully sympathize with your like Japanese outreach problems. So I guess like, you know, obviously we're talking a bit more about the, you know, the kind of like getting films to screen. But I also am really interested to know how you approach it from the other perspective, because obviously, you know, a lot of kind of like repertory screenings, you know, curation kind of has a level of buy-in from audiences. Like, so, you know, like you know, if we look at kind of like people who their kind of aspirations are really about making as much money as possible, like naming no name Secret Cinema, you kind of focus more and more on those rep titles that are really have like a lot of audience connection, you know, were very popular at the time and have built a cult from there. So like your Dirty Dancings, your Star Wars, those kind of films, Back to the Future. But you've kind of again made a rod for your back, which has worked out very well. But I guess I'm just sort of interested in how you kind of do that work of you know, some of making people interested in films that have no name recognition. So like films like The Astrologer, which, you know, like, or other, you know, like something like Crime Wave, which is, you know, kind of more or less unknown to UK audiences, and kind of doesn't even have that thing where there's a famous star they're familiar with, a director, you know, it fits within, you know, kind of like a part of film history or like national cinema that people can go, oh yeah, that's, you know, like how do you kind of like get audiences to part with some of their hard-earned money to see those type of films?
Well, I think for us, it's about trusting that our programming is good, first of all, that we really believe in the films that we're screening. And that can be for various reasons. We've screened, like you said, The Astrologer and Crime Wave, which are these, you know, really just you can't see it anywhere else. And I think that thread and really sticking or being dedicated to that, you can't see this anywhere else, you can't experience this the same way anywhere else, is beneficial, and audiences buy into that. I also think it's been a massive like building exercise for us and audiences, because we did start out with quite, you know, men, neckbeard dominated audiences that I didn't like, and they were just not, I mean, they could have been sustainable, we could have made lots of money, and we could have had lots of men coming to our events, and that's just not where we wanted to sit. And also the films probably deserve better than that anyway. So for us, it's also about thinking about collaborations that make sense for us to reach audiences who maybe our programming is interesting to, but they wouldn't know about it. So a really good example is City of Lost Souls, which is a von Proinheim film, which is actually like a trans punk musical from the 80s, and one of our colleagues in Glasgow Queer Classics, Lydia, brought this film to us and said she would like to do a co-screening, and that was really a really excellent event, because we saw an audience grow to people that maybe wouldn't have been aware of our programming otherwise. And since working with Queer Classics a couple of times, when we program things that aren't explicitly LGBT focused, we're getting a larger LGBT audience. So things like that, where we're able to have that kind of cross-pollination, I guess, is beneficial. I think just being really clear with our marketing as well. So we really enjoy making sure that our marketing is nice and fun and, you know, aesthetically pleasing, I guess. I think marketing is still a thing that we need to crack, and I think that it's still communication-wise something that we're working on. So we're not always 100% getting, you know, thousands and thousands of people coming to see these unknown films. But I think working away to and just believing that your programming should be reaching more people and doing everything you can. So like you say, with in terms of our accessibility reach, that's a really big part of it, because like you say, how do you get people to part with their hard-earned cash? Well, we have a pay what you can afford sliding scale ticket price from £0 to £8. It is not a pay what you feel, so we don't have middle class people saying, oh well, okay, well, I don't really like it, so it's £2. It's not, it's £8 for you. But things like that, and the open captions and everything, and just I think us as an organisation being very clear, because it is just myself and Sean, and we do everything from the programming, the marketing, all the way to like taking the tickets to the door sometimes. That there's that understanding that we really believe in these titles, really believe in access, and really believe that audiences should feel welcomed. So I think that all of that is how we're managing to convince people to come see these films that they wouldn't have heard of. Yeah, it's about trust and love and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I think it is really about that. Like one of the things we talk about a lot in audience development at the ICO is that thing of, it's not about any one event. You kind of have to build up. And I guess what's amazing about Matchbox is the fact that there's a consistency of quality and kind of like enthusiasm. So it's not like, we're a horror film club, we only show horror films. It's like it's always you have to come because it's sometimes the only way to see these things. And also that it's been done with such a degree of care. And I think that follows through with all of the kind of materials you tend to produce, whether that's kind of like posters, things in venue, like all of the sort of kind of like, it's not, it sounds demeaning if I say merch, but it's kind of like, like all of those things demonstrate a level of care. I think that reassures people that you love this thing as much as so much, and hopefully they will as well. So I guess it's really interesting talking to you about you mentioned collaboration, and I think actually I think I was going to say it's really good that you're kind of building up those connections when to show something like City of Lost Souls, one of the few Nobody Ordered Wolves, my programming collective, and Matchbox crossover programming meets. And so if anyone hasn't seen that film, I strongly recommend it. But
it's on YouTube.
That's always the thing. I'm always like, don't look at that until my screening's passed. Let's not publicize that information. But yeah, generally, But hopefully you're putting on an event that satisfies people more than just the fact that they're going to see the film. I guess my question is like, how do you kind of like look at collaboration? Because I get a strong sense that collaboration is like a really important part of the way you approach things. And like up until recently, you were kind of instrumental in pulling together Scala-rama Glasgow, which kind of was a big platform, as you said, for sort of starting new clubs and other groups. So how do you kind of make yourself available for collaboration, let people know that that's something that you want to that they can be involved in, and seek new and seek new partners, like people like graphic designers and those kind of like those sort of people, or like speakers at the event? What's your process in those terms?
Well, I think firstly, don't be a dick is one of the biggest overriding rules that we have. I think that particularly in exhibition, it's very easy to get I guess quite anxious about like the little pocket that you have, or the minute space for funding that's in the sector. But I think that we've really benefited from collaborating with lots of other exhibitors, festivals that are larger than ourselves, and other exhibitors who are just beginning. And those type of collaborations, like I say, help us share audiences, but they also help us learn every day. And I think that that's important as we go out and to do these events. We don't know everything and barely anything actually, and working with other people is a way that we can share our knowledge, pool our experiences, and also just open up the sector to more voices, which I think is massively important, especially like with Matchbox. We're two white, very straight people. I say that because we're a couple, not like I'm not lording over anyone of just how straight we are, but without those collaborations, we would have been able to expand the voices that are programming within Matchbox. So that's really important for us. And in terms of things like guests or graphic designers and things, we've been really lucky to work with people who we admire, and then they become our friends, and then we work with them a wee bit more. So really excellent examples is people like Ella Orleans, the musician, who we've been really fortunate to work with over the last couple of years, with Guy Madden, John Pays, who's the director of Crime Wave, who also did some illustrations for a zine we did recently, and illustrators like Mark Baines, who's done some of our posters, and Vera Navarro, of course, who does all of our Cage things. And these are all people that we'd seen their work and we actually really admired what they do, and we just reached out sincerely, and we had a project in mind, whatever that may have been at the time, and just asked them to collaborate on it. I would also say as well that we make sure we budget appropriately for things like that. So even when we're doing collaborations with other new exhibitors, we always make sure that everyone's getting paid appropriately, and that even if the budget is tight and small, that everyone comes away with their fair share.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I was kind of one of the barriers that people like quite reasonably think about is like is the budget, and having that bottom line of we have to reach a certain number of people in order for this to be even break even. What's your but more broadly, like, what's your process when you're planning an event? Like, how far out are you thinking about, like, even at a conceptual stage from when you will actually deliver it? And how do you sort of like think about budget in those terms? Because it's sort of a bit of a chicken and egg situation.
Yeah.
You can't really think about. Anyway, I'll let you.
Well, I think especially when I was starting out, prior to Matchbox, I was freelance, and a lot of my work was very much project to project. So it helps to have some ideas squirreled away until you can find an appropriate funding pot. And I don't know if guilty is the right word, but I certainly did have some of that, survival programming in me to see the next, if the next like BFI major seasons or whatever came up, I would always have something to pull. I think for Matchbox, we were a bit more organised, or were before the pandemic. So we had got into the habit of or at least planning a year out. So actually just before the lockdown happened, we just submitted our budget for the whole year, which included 7 like almost full festivals, including some programming outlines and ideas for guests, additional content and things like that. So that's a wee bit easier for us because obviously we've delivered things previously and we know the general shape of how we want things to go out into the world. I think if you're starting out, it's really hard because you do want everything to be covered and you want everything to be wonderful and magical. So I would say start there. It doesn't harm anybody to dream big, and actually when you're thinking of all of these wonderful things, think about how the best way for your audience to see these things, the best guests you can have, the best marketing you can have. And then if there is a funding pot that you have in mind, think about how actually sustainably and practically you do that scaling back marketing, or not having fireworks there that night, or something that you can then save for later when you're maybe going to be doing bigger, more funded projects. I would also say that for me, one of my superpowers is being able to write applications almost like in a trance. But it's not because I'm amazing at writing funding applications naturally. I didn't come out with like the BFI's diversity standards on a little like sheet of paper. It's just that you have to know that stuff to be able to get funding. And that can sound insincere sometimes, or like you're fudging things to get the funding right. But actually, if you can look at what certain funders want and certain budgets are for, then you can start thinking, okay, how does my overall project address these concerns in a way that's actually beneficial for audiences, but also and addresses some funding concerns that your funders might have.
Great. I mean, just before I'm going to open it up to the audience in a moment. So start throwing questions into the Q&A. But before it kind of like we move on to that, I think what obviously we're talking back to young programmers and people who are interested in kind of like working independent cinema. I mean, you've talked a lot about access, and I think it's one of the things that like Matchbox and you and Sean are great advocates for holding other people in the industry to account and expressing some of the things that you felt are barriers to independent cinemas being more inclusive, which is a lot of their stated mission. I guess, like, what do you think, we talk about, like, one of the sort of like great unsolvable questions of independent cinemas is how to attract younger audiences. And obviously younger audiences do go to the cinema, but they don't necessarily attend independent cinemas. And I guess it'd just be good for you to let me know what you think are the barriers for independent cinemas attracting younger audiences.
Okay, and we've got 2 hours for this answer. I think fundamentally, unfortunately, independent cinemas are not built to have young people come through their doors, and certainly not working class young people. I think we see a lot of young people coming through young programming projects who are middle and upper class, and are then afforded slightly more opportunities. And if we are catching young working class people coming into these projects, they are not being supported to sustain themselves. I think that that's a big thing in terms of pathways through independent exhibition. They're not very clear, they're very inconsistent, and also if you don't have the personal financing to continue through it, you're just not going to make it. And even though I've been I've been involved in independent exhibitions since I was 15, a lot of that carried panic and just a real shame about it, because I wasn't like the other young programmers that were in my cohort. I didn't have the same opportunities as them, and when I was presented opportunities over the last decade, I was very conscious, although thankful for it, that because I was young and working class and from the East End of Glasgow, that looks great on people's funding applications. That looks great when I get up and I'm holding the hand of the CEO of this organisation that's not quite accessible, but they've got this little working class girl here, so we must be accessible. So I think that there's a lot to be done in terms of the representation of young people within these organisations, sincerely, sustainably, and a real commitment to change that is visible in the organisation, so that young people do know that film programming is a job that they can do.
Okay. Well, that's the
answer.
No. So we've actually got a question that sort of speaks to that a bit more. So you'll have another chance to maybe expand on that a little bit more. But I'm just going to turn to Leslie's question. She asked, what are the challenges or freedoms maintaining audiences online? Is there anything specific to cult films that might hinder or help virtual engagement? So obviously, the Kaleidoscopic Realms move, and you've also done basically a virtual film festival since COVID happened. Like, how have you found that transition?
Yeah, so when everything had to go online, we took a wee bit of time, particularly for audience-facing stuff. So we also run, say, Cage-a-rama Scotland. So we did a wee bit more in terms of industry-facing stuff for the first couple of months of lockdown. And then I think we started to get a wee bit itchy in terms of doing things that were audience-facing. And also we wanted to reassure audiences that we were still here. We haven't gone away with because of the pandemic. So we delivered the Tales from Winnipeg, which was a weekend-long festival and eventive that had Crime Wave, which is one of our staple titles, and then Guy Madden's Carrier's Bend the Knee with Ella Orleans, another staple, and then Tales from Winnipeg Film Group. So we worked very closely with Winnipeg Film Group to deliver this. And it was a lot of work. I think the website's still up with all of the content on, so you can go and have a wee look at how it all fell together. But we did that one because there was a pot of funding available through BFI, so we wanted to take things online. We thought, let's go for it. We've got this project in mind. Let's just do this online, see how it takes. We were slightly disappointed in the audience numbers that attended, I will be honest, but I think that's because we thought we would have, the global audience, and we translated things into French, and we had subtitles in French, and we had subtitles in English, and we had pay what you can afford and all this stuff. But for us, I think for all independent exhibitors, the understanding that online is just like taking your stuff to a new venue. and that you've got all of these new audiences again that you have to do all of that trust building work with and all of that communication. So we saw lots of loyal Matchbox audiences come, but we didn't necessarily see a massive growth in terms of new audiences. I'll show you, we did develop like this little zine that has like a mad amount of new writing and new commissioned work and all of that stuff in it. So, and we sent that out to everyone that bought a weekend pass for this festival. So things like that, where you've got these cult cinema films that have got lots around them, and maybe the people that are involved are still about, and people are really interested in them as little curios, I guess. Being able to build something around that, whether it's a zine or a blog or anything else, is really beneficial. I don't think anyone, independent exhibitor or otherwise, has cracked online quite yet. But I think we're seeing lots of projects like Abattoir Film Festivals on at the moment, and that's really exciting because we couldn't attend that otherwise. So we're getting to attend all these festivals that we wouldn't, but then we were also really into festivals, so we'd go to a festival anyway. So that's not, there's that echo chamber with an exhibition that I don't think we've quite breached yet, and how you actually start having these conversations with audiences that are not your normal audience pool. If that answers the question.
No, that's great. No, I think it's going back to, it's almost like you have to go back to the start of Matchbox and think about, like, you know, like we're well, you know, you weren't known in Glasgow then, and then you kind of built up, and like it's almost like you've located the cinema in a new place, the internet, and now it's kind of like that same trust building exercise. So hopefully people will keep, you know, that kind of a hybrid approach when it's not just something as an alternative. Yeah. Once COVID, once we're through COVID, that blessed moment. So Jerry's asked a question that is very pertinent to the chat. So what tips on career in programming can you give? You program for the BFI. How did you get that opportunity, and can people get paid opportunities through them?
Yeah, so like I said, I was really lucky in that I was involved in a young programmers group anyway. So I would say reach out to your local independent cinema or your local film hub, which is a part of the BFI structure out with London. And they can be really helpful in pointing you in directions of local youth engagement things or opportunities you can get into. I would say that unfortunately not a lot of youth project things are paid or paid appropriately. To be perfectly clear, so I'm also a fan, which is another arm of the BFI Young Consultant at the moment. I have been for 12 or 10 months now. I'm on a 12-month contract and they paid me £250. So every month I watch a film, and then they get a marketing pack out of it. So things like that, even though I'm here in my career, it's still a wee bit shoddy sometimes. I would say that if you're looking for ways to start your own film screenings and get a wee bit of cash through that, whether that's through the funding or through ticket sales, reach out to local independent exhibitors in your area. Again, lots of people are really friendly and just happy that other people want to put on films, and they can be a really good support network, especially when you're just starting out.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. One of the things that I think independent cinemas need to do to be more accessible is advertise those opportunities, because when you're in a space and you think, you know, there's something exciting going on, if you're just an audience member, it seems like a sort of a little bit of a closed box. You know, how do I get into that projection booth and put my thing on there? But actually, you know, I think one of the things that's surprising, even though they don't advertise this and that makes it exclusive, is that they can't, you know, if you have an interesting idea and you think you have clear routes to an audience, independent cinemas can be quite open to collaborations, especially if you're, you know, like you're going to put some legwork into it. So I guess one of the a question from anonymous attendee. I know this is instantly more just like the Riddler, but with a mask, with a face full of questions is what I'm imagining. So they ask, so how is Matchbox's relationship with big, more commercial driven distributors like Park Circus, especially with a pay what you can system? Is it possible to reach the fees they usually ask for and still break even? I think, you know, one of the things that, you know, is definitely a big question independent cinemas is the increasing cost of showing rep cinema, and like it'd just be interesting to know what your take is on that.
Yeah, so again, we're really fortunate. We have a really good relationship with Park Circus, I guess, because we've just been working with them for so long, and also they are a Glasgow-based company, so that's quite helpful. But in terms of how that translates into budgets, so we, I don't know, I guess that there's ways to negotiate with anyone, including the big distributors, and if you lay out very clearly what your budget is, what your intention is for the films and the framing of it, and also, you know, if you're booking more than one film, if you're this, that, and the next thing, there's ways around costing and pricing that can always be negotiated. I think that for us, we're really lucky. We've worked with nearly, I think, every distributor under the sun, because we do things like Cage-a-rama and Keanucon, which are usually the bigger distributors. It is just setting out what the context of the film is. Yeah.
So I guess just on a practical basis, because I think, you know, that's one of the sort of people's resistances to sort of like pay what you can afford, you know. Flexible pricing model. It would just be interesting to know how you, like, obviously, you know, people go, well, how much money am I, you know, from my experience, if you were sort of like talking to, you know, like a Warner Brothers or Universal, they kind of say like, well, how much, isn't everyone going to just want to pay £1 or what, you know, or less?
Yeah. So we've actually found, and with every other independent exhibitor, so in Scotland, lots of mid-tier independent exhibitors have started using the pay what you can afford model. And actually, not only have we seen an increase in box office takings overall, we've also seen an increase in audience numbers overall. So when we're communicating that to distributors, or when we're putting that into a budget, we can't say, oh, X amount will be at £2 and X amount will be at £8. We just like average it off. So we started with an average of about £3 per ticket, and we would communicate that, and we would work out, so if we can sell 54 tickets at £3, it'll be X amount, and we communicate that in budget and to distributors. We've actually seen an increase in our average ticket price over the last 2 years of using it, so it's about £4, and actually online it was even a little higher for people buying tickets than there. So actually, I think that there's a very strong case to be made that pay what you can afford sliding scale ticket prices when they're communicated very clearly. So we use a guide which states things like, if you buy your book secondhand, or if you can go on holiday, or if you can afford to rent a car, and you pay X amount. And that's really helpful for audiences, because you're not asking them then to make a value judgment on the work or the experience. You're just saying, if you are X rich, you pay this, fine. And everyone has the same experience. And we operate a ticketless system. So when you buy it online or at the door, you just go in, you're the exact same as everyone else, regardless of the ticket price you pay.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I think, yeah, so there's something now that the models has some sort of evidence base to sort of say, okay, well, we might get 10 people at £8, but I might get 30 people at, you know, at like a median of £4, £5, £6. Mm-hmm. There's that argument to be made with distributors. Yeah, and it's great to see more and more organizations adopting pay what you can afford. Yeah, so I guess I'm going to turn to another anonymous attendee. I'm just imagining. So there's green Riddler, and now there's purple Riddler. You know, with the question with mark face. So don't know why I need to embody these people. Okay, so obviously one thing that's probably isn't clear if you haven't been to a Matchbox event, but you always have open captions on throughout for every screening you do. Yeah. So that means both the subtitling and the description of what's happening on screen if you're unable to hear sound effects. So it's not like
that is not what captioning is. No, wait, is it?
Yeah, subtitling is. So I was reading your guide earlier on today, and
oh my god, I'm so sorry.
Well, no, I'm happy to be pushed off. So captioning versus subtitling is literally the words on screen, right? The dialogue.
Yeah, dialogue, and then the sound is open captions.
Yeah.
Is that not what you said? Sorry, I went somewhere else. I was ready to fight there. I was like, excuse me.
Well, we're on the same. In any case, we're on the same page now. So anyway, the question is, with open captions at your event, do you ever get any negativity from hearing audiences? And how do you encourage audiences to attend films with captions or subtitles? Now, I think this is a sort of case where people feel like, oh, we can't do that, people will get annoyed. Has that been your experience?
No, because my audience fear me. No, actually, throughout the 2 years that we've been doing open captions on screen, we've never had one complaint from a hearing audience or otherwise. So we are very clear in our marketing and our online presence. Evidently, I don't know what captioning is, but when we're communicating that to audiences, we're very clear, and we just underpin it as a thing that is inherent to our events so that people can attend them. So the same way that we have a ramp outside of our venue so that it's accessible, we have captions on screen so that it's also accessible. Like I say, we've had people ask about it. Hearing audiences are interested in it, but we've never had a negative comment, I think, because we are so clear in that we want everyone to be able to attend our events. And I do think that that's a fear that a lot of independent exhibitors, and particularly independent cinemas, carry with them, is how audiences will react to this. But I think that it's about being brave in what you're doing and your choices. And actually, as programmers and as exhibitors, we've convinced audiences to do a lot more mad things than watch films with captions. We are currently getting audiences into cinemas during a global pandemic, and we've weeked out chairs and we're making them walk one way around the venue. I am absolutely certain that if we fully explain to audiences in a clear and concise manner why this is happening, they will just stick it. Because if we don't take them off, they've got no option.
So I think the other thing, I'd be interested. Do you find that do you have a following of deaf or hard of hearing audiences because of that consistency in building that development? Because I think one of the things that independent cinemas often struggle with is having that consistency and building that trust with audiences that, in my experiences, deaf audiences often feel excluded or marginalized because their screenings are, kind of like first thing on a Sunday or afternoon on a weekday, and lots of deaf people are in their jobs at those times, or that's just Sunday morning isn't a slot that works for them.
Yeah, so actually I think we've still got a wee bit of a way to go to developing deaf or hard of hearing audiences that come into our events. We've certainly got quite a lot of engagement with deaf and hard of hearing people online, because we also caption trailers and things like that when big studios release them and they don't have captions. So like the new Batman and things like that, and we do that just ad hoc, and so people share that, and that's quite nice to have that engagement. And I think we had a really nice, the only comment on our YouTube was made the other week, and it was just someone who said, "Thanks for this, I'm deaf, this helps." And it was just like that really nice little thing of saying, okay, people are using this, and that's it's unfortunate that we have to be the ones that are doing things for the big studios, or even like BIFA when they launched their Get Back to Cinema campaign and they didn't have captions on it. Having to be reactionary to those types of things is maybe weary for us, but not as weary as being a deaf of hard of hearing audience member who can't access that content.
Yeah, I think it's like all change, it's a difficult and long road, but I think eventually, the curve of history bends towards justice. So it's a really good thing to not shut up about. So we've got about 10 minutes left, so I just get through a few more questions that I think are really interesting. So Yvonne asks, what tips do you have to engage young people with online or digital events, film events, let's just say?
I think if they're led by young people, that's always a good place to start, and making sure that that's front and center of your marketing and how you're communicating that, and actually handing that over maybe to the young people with support and giving them guidance or training in that is really useful, and lets young people understand that this isn't like something for the youths online, like a cinema doing TikTok dances or something.
Yeah, so I think it's often a more simple question than people think it is, that you trust, if you want young people, let young people do it, and really follow that through and give them that space to build those audiences, and maybe I hate to say it, fail in a mitigated, in some, as we all do when we're starting out doing things. It's a healthy part of the growth mindset. So, and then kind of tying in that with that kind of question, Cara asks, do you have any advice on targeting and retaining underrepresented audiences in a way that's sincere and doesn't feel tokenistic, balanced against the fact that you're often having an association, maybe via funding, with institutions that don't feel as sincere? So that sort of thing of like, this is for you, but in a way we're supported by an institution that there may be like groups of, you know, you're talking about that experience of you know, your independent cinema CEO who's like, this is great, this makes me look great, and you know, it might have made you feel like sort of even more token like having a more tokenistic place. So how do you sort of think you navigate that path?
I think in terms of yourself as a programmer, especially if you're working in partnership with organisations that maybe aren't as sincere or you know, inherently really trying to make change, is about being really vocal about it. And I think that one of the things that we can, as young programmers entering the industry, I'd really like to encourage people to be more vocal about if they feel that things aren't right, or if they think that something's tokenistic, or if they see something's not working in the cinema, or if just in general the sector is not working for them, is say it, is be really vocal about it and be really confident in that. I love independent cinema. It's been my life, you know, it's been all my adult life. Is there a day goes by that I don't say something horrifically negative about the sector? No, I'm constantly railing on the sector because it can do better. And I think that particularly young programmers are the ones that are able to identify that and say, actually, this isn't working for these audience groups, this isn't good enough. And just being confident in yourself, and that if you're burning any bridges, they weren't worth crossing anyway.
Yeah, so it's less about fitting in the box and more about expressing where you are, because you know that it's definitely a challenge. You know, we're a distributor of funds. You know, obviously we care about independent cinemas, but we you know, and there's a variety of people in the organization, but we, you know, we can't pretend that we speak to everyone, and we, you know, there's always representations that we could do better for, and that and voices that we could stand to hear. So you know, if you're finding things difficult, it's worth giving that feedback. And yeah, I think we, like, speaking from an institutional side, like we definitely appreciate, like, as much as sometimes, you know, you kind of first reaction is, oh, we're doing it wrong, and you're anxious because you're at work. And I think generally those conversations are really valuable, and it's not going to get better for any of us if we don't have those kind of conversations. So I'm just trying to get through as many of people's questions as we can. So yeah, oh wow, we're going to go quite abstract. In your opinion,
Yes.
asked Coco, is there any difference between being a curator and a programmer?
Well, that's a really good question. So I think if you're thinking of yourself as a curator, there's maybe something a wee bit more personal about that. So I would say maybe I curated the first Kaleidoscopic Realms program, probably because I thought that not many people would be interested, but actually it was probably the most successful Matchbox event we've ever had. We had double-digit people queuing because we didn't have any more seats, physically couldn't fit people in. And that was, you know, experimental Japanese, very abstract work that probably had a curatorial eye, because I was thinking a wee bit more, I don't want to say academically, but a wee bit more in depth in terms of the actual content. And then I would say programming has a wee bit more of the all-encompassing business about it. So you're thinking about how a film relates to certain, you know, strands, or if you're programming it alongside something else, what is the relationship there? But also, how does it meet certain budget or funder outcomes? Maybe how it interacts with a certain audience that you're looking to expand. Yeah, I think the differences are very slight. I would say a curator is quite fancy, and a programmer is quite practical.
Okay, that's the smell test I would have put it through. But at base, that's kind of like how I think about it. So just a couple more questions. So Guy asks, I mean, we've talked about this a little bit, so maybe if you feel, I mean, I know it's a topic you could talk about like at length. So, but just mindful of the time. Guy asks, do you have any thoughts about how to attract more working class young people into the cultural cinema sector?
So I think it's representing these voices within the organisation and also on screen. I think particularly in Scotland, we're seeing some really exciting working class filmmakers coming up, particularly James Price, who's making some really exceptional work, not just as a Scottish filmmaker, but as a filmmaker. And on screen has to go hand in hand with exhibitions, so you can't insincerely be putting on I, Daniel Blake, if you're paying your front of house less than like minimum wage and things like that. So yeah, I think organisations fully committing to being open to working class young people in a way that they feel supported by other people who have their experiences. I certainly don't know any peers who went through the same type of poverty-driven anxieties, which is a nice way of putting it, that I did as a young person, and certainly don't know any people who are young, running young programmer projects and things at the moment who would be able to sincerely say that they have those types of lived experiences that would really be a comfort to young people coming into these types of organisations and not feeling that they're at a disadvantage because of their class backgrounds. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
no, I think, yeah, no, that's good. I think it's about providing a decent job and not making assumptions about people's background, because like lots of, I think there's definitely jobs in the independent sector that don't that assume probably that you actually haven't, maybe your financial independence as a baseline. So it's and just that broader consciousness about making sure you're representing those voices. So that's and letting people follow those passions and let that be on screen, as well as including them in the organization as a necessary part. So this this is quite a big question, but I'm going to get to this because it's an international question. So and that amuses me. So the question is, I work at a small, so Julia writes, I work at a small cinema in central Maine in the US. Although Maine is often thought as quote the oldest, whitest state in the nation, unquote, there are an increasing number of immigrants and young people. What's your advice? And that's actually, I should say that that's a response we often get from independent cinemas, that they sort of feel like we're not very diverse here. So what's your advice on building a young programmer's education opportunity from the ground up? What kind of resources should we start with?
I mean, I think budget is a big thing. I think you need to have the budget to really engage young people and, like I said, properly pay them. I do think that reimbursing travel is the baseline you should be doing. And if you're able to pay them X amount every month to engage with your project, then that's a really good start. Like I said, I think having the person who's running these young programming projects, or at least people who are involved representing the young people that you're wanting to engage, that's really important. And also starting from a place where you're reaching out from your organization, you're not assuming that these young people are already there or engaging with your lines of communication. So really stretching yourself, going to these youth groups, even physically if you can. Obviously in COVID times, that's not necessarily the case, but sincerely engaging with these young people in places that they already are and offering them something. It's not just a come and help our cinema and we'll put on a youth thing and it will look really good for us. And but actually saying, if you engage with this and there's all these opportunities and there's this whole sector that is really exciting and interesting and already has people like you working in it who are really enjoying themselves because they get to show people films all day. I think that sincerity has to be at the heart of it, and showing that it's not just a beneficial project for your cinema, but actually that you understand that the reason that young people need to be engaged in this is because the sector is aging very rapidly. And if we want cinema to survive, it's not just a pandemic we need to worry about.
Yeah, I think it's really important to start off with that sense that this is a necessary thing rather than a peripheral part of your program. And yeah, I think that's really essential. Like it's like mutual liberation rather than kind of like paternalistic, like let's help these poor people. So okay, so I think whenever I kind of like attend a session like this, that like I get very inspired, but then there's often that thing of think, well, not me, how could I do it? If you were that of that mindset, what's the one? And you've maybe this is something that is more applicable post-COVID. what's the one thing you would say to someone who was thinking about putting on, starting programming and putting on their own events?
I think if you ever have that self-doubt and think, why me? I can't do it. Look around, there's plenty of people who are like shoddier and have less to say through programming than you. And certainly if you're coming from an underrepresented background, it's only underrepresented because the sector has wanted it to be that way. So just continue to push through. And like I say, just be fearless with what you're doing. And I know that that's hard, especially with, if, you know, it's financially destabilizing and all of that stuff. But if there's a way that you can do it and that you feel you have something necessary and important to say, just say it, because there's plenty of people saying stuff that isn't necessary nor important.
So yeah, as a good piece of advice in all areas of life, look to the mediocrity of the, just, you know, fill yourself with the confidence of the average white man. Speaking as one. So we're going to finish up. So you might be aware that we're Megan selected a film for the watch party later tonight, which is Ghost Stories, and we're going to have a watch along from 7 p.m. and you can join the discussion on Twitter using hashtag YFP Watch Party. I really like Ghost Stories. I think it was one of those films that didn't get its due in cinemas really. And like if you're a horror fan, it's kind of there's two types, you know. I always think about like there's scary movies and then there's spooky movies. And like if you're generally, I think that people who aren't horror fans that can't get into scary movies, but spooky movies are kind of more are like the nicer end of the spectrum. So I think if you haven't seen Ghost Stories, it's a really good one to check out. And also it's a portmanteau horror, so you've got a 3-for-1 there. But yeah, so Megan's incredibly recorded an intro from the film's director, Andy Nyman. So in a moment we'll turn to that. But I just want to say thanks so much, Megan. This is really fantastic opportunity for me. That's all that matters really. Yeah. And I'm glad other people got to listen in as well. But you know, it was good for me. So if people want to get in touch with you, is that all right?
No.
Okay.
Yes, good. That's absolutely fine. Yeah, people can email me directly. I'm sure we can put out my email somewhere. I'm also on Twitter, so you can reach out there. And what follow. I will say, yeah, like follow.
I recommend it.
Yeah, if you enjoy like anger-driven rants about film exhibition such as this, you'll love the distilled versions on Twitter. What I will say about the director's recorded intro is that might seem like pure amazing, but I actually chose Ghost Stories because one, I think it's a really good British film that doesn't look like an episode of EastEnders, but is also free on BBC iPlayer, which I thought was really important. And then I emailed the director Andy and said, I'm doing this thing, can I have an intro? And he fired right back with it. So I think that's a perfect example of like, always ask if there's talent involved or anybody else. Like if you ask a question, people are usually super happy to help.
Amazing. Well, that you've embodied all the things we've been talking about. Don't ask, don't get. Thanks so much, Megan. Now we'll hand over to Andy.
Hello there, Matchbox Cine Club. This is Andy Nyman. I'm so flattered and excited that you are being screened Ghost Stories. It is a film that myself and Jeremy Dyson wrote and directed. We wrote it and directed it first for the stage, and then we adapted it and we directed it, and I star in it. And one of the things that was really important to us when we made it was that it was a uniquely British film. We were offered a couple of American studios that wanted to make the film, and we turned them down. We made it with Warp Films. We wanted to keep it British, but not feel like a little tiny British film. It was really important to us that it felt like proper cinema and a proper British film that had an international feel to it. So we were absolutely delighted that it had such acclaim and played all over the world. and was so well supported by programmers in the UK in particular. It's essential when you're programming that you support British films and interesting British films, but also that you find a way to try and encourage British films to not just be tiny, to have a wide scope and feel like films. And that was one of the things that was so important to us, that it was proper cinema. It had a full orchestral score, it had a soundtrack, its sound was big and as good as any international film. So if you haven't seen it, I seriously hope you enjoy it. If you have seen it, I hope you enjoy it again and spot lots of little secrets and things you didn't see the first time. But once again, have a brilliant time watching it, and thank you so much.
Okay, thanks so much, folks. I hope you have a great evening, and hopefully some of you join us for Ghost Stories later on tonight. Thanks very much. Cheers, Megan.
Thanks, guys.
All right, bye.
Bye.